Close your eyes and let the heavy electric hum of the modern world fade into silence, replaced by the crackle of a hearth and the wind sighing through ancient thatch, as we drift back to a time when night was truly dark and life was a fragile, flickering candle. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your city and local time in the comments so we can see where everyone is listening from. When people imagine medieval childhood, they often picture rosy-cheeked children playing in sunny courtyards, learning their letters from gentle monks, or growing up safely under the protection of family and faith. The reality was far harsher. Medieval childhood, for most, was short, dangerous, physically demanding, and brutally uncertain. Children were not sheltered from the adult world. They were thrown into it early, expected to survive, work, and endure with little complaint. The truth is that childhood in the Middle Ages was less a protected stage of life and more a brief preparation for hardship. From the moment a child was born, survival was not guaranteed. Infant mortality rates were staggering. In many regions of medieval Europe, as many as 30 to 50% of children died before reaching the age of 5. Disease, malnutrition, poor hygiene, and lack of medical knowledge meant that even minor illnesses could be fatal. Fevers, diarrhea, respiratory infections, and simple injuries often ended lives quickly. There were no antibiotics, no vaccines, and very limited understanding of infection. Parents baptized babies almost immediately, not out of tradition alone, but because death was so common that delaying baptism risked eternal consequences in their belief system. Sanitation was primitive at best. Homes were often overcrowded, shared with animals, and filled with smoke from open hearths. Waste disposal systems were rudimentary or non-existent. Children crawled and played on dirt floors, contaminated with animal droppings, parasites, and human waste. Lice, fleas, and intestinal worms were constant companions. Clean water was rare, and contaminated water sources spread disease rapidly. Childhood sickness was not an exception. It was the norm. Once a child survived early childhood, work began, often shockingly early by modern standards. By the age of 5 or 6, many children were already contributing economically. Peasant children helped in fields, tended animals, collected firewood, fetched water, and assisted with food preparation. In towns, children were sent to workshops as apprentices, servants, or helpers. These were not light tasks designed for learning. They were physically demanding, repetitive, and sometimes dangerous. Long hours, little rest, and harsh discipline were standard. Childhood labor was not seen as exploitation. It was survival. Education for most children was non-existent. Literacy was a privilege reserved for clergy, nobility, and a small urban elite. Peasant children learned practical skills from their parents, not reading or writing. Even among the upper classes, education focused on obedience, religious instruction, and preparation for adult roles. Boys were trained for warfare, administration, or church service. Girls were taught domestic management, obedience, and early motherhood. Curiosity and play were not priorities. Usefulness was. Violence was an accepted part of upbringing. Corporal punishment was common in homes, schools, and apprenticeships. Beatings were believed to build character, discipline, and moral strength. There was little concept of psychological trauma or emotional well-being. Children were expected to obey absolutely, endure pain silently, and accept authority without question. Love existed, but it was often expressed through survival rather than tenderness. Keeping a child alive was considered proof enough of care. Nutrition further shaped the harshness of medieval childhood. Diets were monotonous and often inadequate. Bread, porridge, and thin soups made up the bulk of meals. Protein was scarce for the poor, and seasonal hunger was common. Children suffered from stunted growth, weakened immune systems, and chronic malnutrition. Famine did not discriminate by age. In bad years, children were among the first to die. Clothing offered little protection. Many children wore the same garments year-round, poorly fitted and rarely washed. Shoes were a luxury. Many went barefoot even in winter. Exposure to cold, heat, and rain was routine. Combined with poor nutrition, this made illness and injury more likely and recovery slower. Emotionally, medieval childhood was shaped by constant loss. Siblings died frequently. Mothers often died in childbirth. Fathers were lost to war, disease, or accidents. Children grew up surrounded by death, attending funerals regularly, and learning early that life was fragile. This did not necessarily make them heartless, but it forced a level of emotional resilience few modern children are asked to develop. For orphaned children, life was even harsher. Some were taken in by extended family, others sent to monasteries, workshops, or charitable institutions. Many ended up begging or living on the streets. Exploitation and abuse were common, and legal protections were minimal. Childhood offered no guarantee of safety. Even play, when it existed, was often a reflection of adult life. Toys were simple: wooden swords, dolls made of cloth, balls of rags. Games mimicked warfare, farming, or household labor. Play was not separated from preparation for adult responsibility. It was rehearsal. In short, medieval childhood was not a golden age of innocence. It was a test of endurance. Children were valued, loved, and mourned, but they were not protected from hardship. Society expected them to grow up fast, or not at all. Survival was the primary achievement. Understanding the filthy truth about medieval childhood forces us to confront how recent our modern ideas of childhood really are. Safety, education, emotional care, and players' rights rather than luxuries are developments of the last few centuries. For medieval children, there was no long childhood, only a brief, dangerous passage into a demanding adult world. Now, imagine yourself floating invisibly into the very center of this dangerous passage, into a small, timber-framed room in 14th century England, or perhaps a stone cottage in rural France. It is the perilous threshold, the birthing chamber. The air here is not fresh. It is thick, heavy, and deliberately stifling. The windows are shuttered tight, plugged with rags or straw, for the medieval mind fears that a draught is not just moving air, but a vehicle for malicious spirits, or the miasma that carries sickness. In this dim amber light, cast by expensive beeswax in a noble's home, or smoky tallow in a peasant's, we find the first defining struggle of existence. A woman labors on a birthing stool, or perhaps on a mattress of straw softened with linens, surrounded exclusively by other women. This is a feminine kingdom. The father is usually pacing anxiously outside, perhaps checking the stars or praying, but almost certainly useless in the immediate crisis, a fact that hasn't changed much in 1,000 years. The room smells of sweat, of iron-scented blood, and of strong herbs, mugwort and mint crushed into poultices to speed the delivery. The midwife is the commander here. She is not a doctor with a degree from Paris or Bologna. She is a local woman of experience, her hands rough but capable, her knowledge a blend of practical mechanics and ancient superstition. She might place a piece of jasper on the mother's thigh to ease the pain, or murmur a prayer to Saint Margaret, the patron saint of childbirth, who famously burst from the belly of a dragon, a rather dramatic, if fitting, metaphor for the violence of birth. Historians still argue whether medieval people detached themselves emotionally from infants to protect against the pain of loss, a theory popularized in the 1960s. But looking at the anxious faces in this room, the terror in the mother's eyes, and the desperate prayers whispered into the smoky air, it is hard to believe they did not care. They cared fiercely. They just knew the odds. When the child finally arrives, slippery and crying, the relief is instantaneous but brief. The baby is not washed in a sterilized sink, but wiped down, sometimes with wine or rose water if the family is wealthy, or simply with a warm cloth. The umbilical cord is cut, and here the clock starts ticking. The fear is not just biological, it is spiritual. If the baby is weak, the midwife is authorized by the church to perform an emergency baptism right there, with a cup of water and a few hurried Latin words. It is a frantic race against original sin, a desperate attempt to ensure that, if this tiny spark is extinguished, it does not vanish into the dark limbo of the unbaptized. We watch as the newborn, eyes squeezed shut against the sudden candlelight, takes its first breath of that smoky, heavy air. They have survived the first hurdle, the perilous crossing from the womb to the world. But as the midwife inspects the infant, checking for deformities that might be interpreted as omens or curses, we realize the struggle has only just begun. The baby is alive, yes, but it is utterly defenseless, a soft, warm thing in a cold, hard century. The women coo and wrap the child, their voices a low hum of comfort. But outside, the wind howls, and the bacteria that thrive in the dirt floors and the contaminated water are waiting. The child is here. Now, they must be bound. The room quiets, the chaotic energy of birth settling into the rhythmic, heavy silence of the aftermath, and we turn our gaze to the infant, who is about to undergo a transformation as rigorous as any knighting ceremony. The midwife or the mother takes strips of linen, perhaps softened by age or perhaps scratchy and new, and begins the process of swaddling. This is not the loose, comforting wrap of a modern maternity ward. This is structural engineering. In the medieval mind, a newborn is not merely fragile, it is dangerously unfinished, a creature of soft cartilage and chaotic humors that must be physically molded into humanity. There is a genuine, pervasive fear that without strict binding, a child's limbs will grow crooked, their spine will warp, or, most terrifying of all, they might revert to a primal state and crawl on all fours like a beast of the field. And so, the binding begins. The infant's arms are pressed straight down against their sides, their legs extended perfectly parallel, and the linen bands are wound tight, round and round, layer upon layer, until the child is effectively mummified. They are stiff, immobile, a tiny statue of cloth with only a face exposed to the flickering dark. It looks uncomfortable to our eyes, perhaps even cruel, but to the medieval parent, this is the ultimate act of care. They are literally holding their child together, shaping the soft wax of the body before it hardens. One might say they invented the burrito method long before it became a late-night snack staple. though with significantly more existential dread attached. This immobility serves a practical purpose too, in a world teeming with open fires and hungry farm animals. A baby that cannot move is a baby that cannot roll into the hearth or be stepped on by a wandering pig. Once bound, the infant is placed in a cradle, a hollowed-out log, or a basket of woven willow, and there they will stay for the vast majority of their first few months. The hygiene within this linen cocoon is, by modern standards, confronting. There are no disposable diapers, no chemically scented wipes. The baby is wrapped in a tailclout, a simple cloth to catch waste, sometimes packed with dry moss or sphagnum, which has natural antiseptic properties. A surprisingly clever adaptation from nature. However, changing these swaddling bands is a laborious process, involving the complete unwinding and rewinding of the child, and so it is not done often. A baby might lie in their own dampness for hours, the smell of urine and sour milk becoming the permanent perfume of the nursery. Physicians of the time, following the ancient texts of Galen, actually debate whether urine might be beneficial for the skin, a hardening agent for a tough life ahead, which is a convenient theory when laundry involves boiling water over a fire and scrubbing with harsh lye soap. We see the baby's skin redden and chafe, a condition known as the scald. But there is no diaper cream, only perhaps a little goose grease or rose oil if the family can afford it. In this state of suspension, the child's world is reduced to the ceiling beams and the face of the wet nurse. For the wealthy, the mother rarely breastfeeds. It is considered gauche or simply too taxing for a noblewoman whose primary duty is to recover and produce more heirs. Instead, the baby is often sent away, physically removed from the parent's home to live in a rural cottage with a wet nurse for years. It is a strange, detached start to life, surviving on the milk of a stranger who may be nursing her own child. Simultaneously, there is a profound belief that character and morals are transmitted through breast milk. A noble father might worry that the milk of a drunkard or a choleric woman will corrupt his heir's blood, yet the risk is taken because the alternative, hand-feeding with a bubby pot made of cow's horn, is a death sentence, almost guaranteed to kill the child with bacteria. For the peasant child, the experience is more intimate but no less grimy. They hang from their mother's back in a sling as she works the fields, or rock in a corner of the hut, inhaling the dust of threshing. The cradle itself is often suspended on ropes to keep it away from the rats that scuttle across the rush-covered floors at night. We watch the baby's eyes track the movement of a spider weaving its web in the corner, the only entertainment available. It is a life of sensory deprivation and sensory overload all at once. The constriction of the limbs, the itch of the wool, the overwhelming smell of wood smoke that permeates every fiber of clothing, and the constant rhythmic rocking. The rocking is vigorous, believed to help digest the milk and soothe the wildness of the infant spirit. Historians still argue about the psychological impact of this restraint. Did it create a generation of passive, patient adults used to limited freedom, or did it store up a deep, latent rage? We cannot know, but we can feel the stillness. As the fire burns down to embers, the room grows cold, medieval houses are drafty, and winter penetrates the stone. The baby, unable to shiver effectively in their bindings, relies entirely on the shared heat of the room and the layers of wool. If they cry, they are often soothed, not with a gentle pickup, for unswaddling takes too long, but with a rag soaked in sugar water, or sometimes, chillingly, a little wine or poppy juice to induce sleep. Survival here is a quiet, static game. The infant is a passenger in their own body, waiting for the day they are deemed strong enough to be released from the linen prison. They drift into sleep, a sleep heavy with the carbon monoxide of the indoor fire, dreaming perhaps of movement they have not yet tasted. The shadow of the nurse rocks the cradle with a foot, her hands busy spinning wool, the hum of the wheel blending with the baby's breath. They are safe, for now, bound tight against the chaos, a small, stiff loaf of humanity baking in the slow heat of history. But soon the bands will come off, and the real danger, the danger of movement, will begin. The day finally arrives when the linen bands are unspooled for the last time, lying like shed snakeskin on the floor, and the child is set free. It is a moment of triumph, but as we watch the toddler take those first, lurching, drunken steps across the packed earth floor, we realize that the cradle was not just a prison. It was a fortress. Now, the defenses are down. The medieval home, particularly for the peasant majority, is an obstacle course of lethal hazards that would give a modern safety inspector heart palpitations. There is no concept of baby-proofing here. The world is sharp, hot, and unforgiving, and the child is expected to learn the geography of pain very quickly. To aid in this perilous navigation, we might see a surprising piece of technology trundle into view: a walker. Yes, historians and archaeologists have uncovered illustrations and references to wooden walking frames, cages on wheels essentially, dating back centuries. They look charmingly rustic, built by a local carpenter or a handy father, but they function as mobile siege towers, allowing the curious toddler to zoom towards the open hearth with alarming speed. And the hearth is the sun around which domestic life orbits, a gaping mouth of heat and danger. It is not tucked away behind glass or a safety gate. It is often an open fire in the center of the room or against a wall, where a heavy iron cauldron bubbles with pottage or water for washing. The fascination of the dancing flames is primal, and the coroner's rolls, those grim, dutifully kept records of accidental deaths, tell us a heartbreakingly repetitive story. We read of children scalded by tipping over boiling pots, their tunics catching fire as they reached for a spark, or stumbling into the embers while chasing a ball. The burns are treated with egg whites or ointments of lily root, but the infection that follows is often the true killer. We watch the mother in the background, and we must judge her gently. She is not negligent. She is overworked. She is spinning wool, kneading dough, churning butter, and feeding the livestock, often all at once. She cannot hover like a modern helicopter parent, because if she stops working, the family does not eat. She relies on the eyes of the village, an older sibling, a grandmother, or just the open door, to keep watch. But a toddler's curiosity is faster than a tired mother's reflexes. The floor itself is a landscape of biological hazards. In a peasant cottage, the floor is dirt, covered in rushes, dried grasses or reeds that are meant to provide insulation. In reality, they become a compost layer of dropped food, animal dung, flea larvae, and spit. The child, crawling and toddling, is in constant contact with this ecosystem. They find things dropped in the rushes: a rusty knife used for cutting leather, a spindle whorl heavy enough to choke on, or perhaps a needle lost during mending. The mouth is the primary tool of exploration for a toddler, and everything goes in. But the dangers are not just inanimate. The medieval house is a shared space, a veritable Noah's Ark of domestic beasts. Chickens roost in the rafters, dropping feathers and mites. Dogs fight over scraps in the corner. And most dangerously, the family pig often has free rein. A medieval pig is not the docile pink creature of storybooks. It is a semi-wild, bristly, muscular animal driven by an insatiable appetite. In the cramped gloom of the cottage, a toddler clutching a piece of bread is fair game. There are accounts, gruesome and terse, of pigs attacking children in their cradles, or as they played on the floor. It is a shocking intrusion of the brutal natural world into the sanctity of the home. A reminder that humanity has not yet fully separated itself from the animal kingdom. We might see a cat, too, prowling the rafters for mice. But legend suggests cats were sometimes viewed with suspicion, associated with witchcraft or suffocation myths, though in practice they were tolerated as essential pest control. A blurry line between pet and employee that cats have successfully maintained to this day. Beyond the threshold of the door, the dangers multiply. If the hearth is the internal threat, water is the external predator. Every village has a well, a stream, or a pond. Wells are sometimes covered with a simple wooden lid, but often they are open, wet, and slippery with moss. A toddler, escaping the smoky interior for the fresh air, is drawn to the shimmering surface. The coroner's rolls of Oxford and London are filled with the tragic entries of misadventure, children who wandered off to gaze at their reflection or float a stick and slipped into the dark water. Drowning was one of the most common causes of accidental death for medieval children, a silent thief that struck in the moments between chores. It is here that we encounter a poignant intersection of faith and grief. When a child was found in the water, unresponsive, the parents might attempt a miracle. There are records of frantic prayers to saints. St. Thomas Becket was a popular choice for such emergencies, accompanied by the ritual of measuring the child. The parents would take a string or a candle the exact length of the child's body and offer it to the shrine in exchange for a revival. It is a desperate, magical negotiation with the divine, a plea to reverse the cold finality of the accident. Sometimes, stories circulated of children coughing up water and returning to life, fueling the hope that faith could overrule the coroner. But often, the string was left at the altar, a silent testament to a light extinguished too soon. As the sun sets, casting long dancing shadows against the wattle and daub walls, the toddler is scooped up, perhaps with a scolding for getting too close to the fire or muddying their tunic. The relief of the parents is unspoken but palpable. They have steered this small, chaotic ship through another day of jagged reefs. The child is wiped down, not bathed, for full immersion is rare and dangerous, and fed a scrap of bread dipped in milk. They are alive. They have navigated the fire, the pig, and the well. But as they settle down to sleep, their belly rumbling, we realize that avoiding injury is only half the battle. The body needs fuel to grow, to harden, to withstand the cold. And in a world where the harvest dictates survival, that fuel is not always guaranteed. The fire may not burn them, but the emptiness of the larder might. The hazards of the environment now give way to the hazards of the economy, as the toddler wakes to a world where hunger is a constant, quiet roommate, waiting at the table. The sun rises, pale and watery, through the thin membrane of stretched animal skin or oiled paper that serves as a window. And with the light comes the gnawing. It is a sensation as familiar to the medieval child as the itch of wool or the bite of the frost, the hollow, cramping emptiness of a stomach that was never quite filled the night before. We drift into the morning routine, where the dangers of the hearth and the well recede, replaced by the relentless arithmetic of survival. How much grain is left in the bin, and how many mouths must it feed? The morning meal, if it exists at all, is not a spread of eggs and pastries. It is likely a hunk of bread, left over from the baking day, which might have been a week ago. This bread is the absolute foundation of existence, the staff of life in a literal sense, but it is not the soft, white, air-filled loaf of the modern supermarket. For the peasant child, it is maslin or rye bread, dark, dense, and heavy as a brick. It has a sour tang from the sourdough starter, and if you listen closely as the child chews, you might hear a faint grinding sound. This is the grit of the millstone, the tiny fragments of rock that wear down teeth long before old age sets in. To a modern palate, it would taste distinctively earthy, perhaps even dusty. But to a hungry child in 13th century Saxony, it tastes like salvation. If they are lucky, the bread is accompanied by white meats, not the breast of a chicken, but the products of the dairy, a scraping of hard cheese, a cup of whey, or perhaps some curds. Historians often debate the protein intake of the medieval peasant, noting that while red meat was a rare luxury reserved for feast days or poachers, the reliance on dairy provided a crucial, if inconsistent, nutritional floor. But the centerpiece of the medieval diet, the bubbling heart of the home, is the pottage. We move to the iron cauldron hanging over the fire, the black kettle that is never fully emptied, only replenished. This is the perpetual stew. It contains whatever the garden and the fields have surrendered: dried peas, field beans, onions, cabbage, garlic, and herbs like parsley and sage to mask the monotony. It is a thick, sludge-like porridge, varying from green to brown depending on the season. For a child, this pottage is breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It is warm, which is a mercy in a cold house, but it is dangerously low in fats and essential vitamins. We see the child dipping their crust into the bowl, their small fingers stained with soot. They do not complain about the lack of variety. The concept of picky eating is a luxury for a future century. In this world, if you don't eat the turnips, you don't eat. There is a dark humor in realizing that the medieval parent never had to negotiate with a toddler to eat their broccoli. Hunger is the ultimate source. But even this simple diet is at the mercy of the seasons. And here, we encounter the true villain of medieval childhood, the hungry gap. As the year turns and winter bleeds into spring, the supplies in the root cellar dwindle. The apples have rotted, the onions have sprouted, and the grain bin shows the wood at the bottom. The new crops are in the ground, green and promising, but they are months away from harvest. This period, usually late spring, is a time of quiet desperation. We watch the child grow thinner, their eyes seemingly larger in a face that has lost its baby fat. Their energy drops, play becomes less vigorous, replaced by a lethargic stillness. This is not starvation in the dramatic sense of a famine, but a chronic, low-level malnutrition that stunts growth and weakens the immune system. We see the physical evidence in the skeletal remains dug up by archaeologists. Harris lines on the shin bones, horizontal ridges that form when bone growth stops due to malnutrition, and then starts again when food returns. They are biological tree rings of suffering, permanent records of the winters that almost won. During these lean times, the parents make heart-wrenching calculations. The working adults, the father pushing the plow, the mother tending the animals, must eat to keep the family economy functioning. If they collapse, everyone dies. So the children often receive the smallest portion, the thinnest soup. It is a brutal triage born of necessity, not cruelty. And when the grain is low, the quality drops. The family might be forced to make bread from beans, acorns, or even bran, meant for the pigs. Here, a microscopic monster lurks. If the rye has been stored in damp conditions, it can be infected with a fungus called ergot. When baked into bread, it is tasteless and invisible, but its effects are terrifying. We might see a child suddenly gripped by burning sensations in their limbs, a condition known as St. Anthony's fire, or suffering from hallucinations and convulsions. In a deeply religious world, these symptoms are often interpreted as demonic possession or a test of faith, leading to prayers and exorcisms rather than a check of the flour bin. It is a horror story written in mold, affecting the most vulnerable first. We must also look at what flows into their cups. There is a persistent myth that medieval children drank only beer or ale because the water was deadly. While it is true that small beer, a weak, low-alcohol brew, was common and safer because the boiling process killed bacteria, it was not the only option. Water was drunk, often from streams or wells, but it was a gamble. We watch a thirsty child scoop water from a rain barrel, unaware of the invisible microbial zoo swimming within. The resulting dysentery or bloody flux is a leading killer, draining the life from a body already weakened by the hungry gap. For the infant transitioning from breast milk to solid food, the danger is acute. This process, known as weaning, often happens around age 2 or 3. The child is given pap, bread soaked in milk, water, or broth. But in a world without sterilization, the vessel used to feed them, sometimes a cow's horn with a piece of leather for a nipple, is a bacterial bomb. Weaning is often the time when children die, their digestive systems overwhelmed by the sudden introduction of contaminated food. It is a perilous bridge to cross. Yet amidst this scarcity, there is a fierce, protective love. We see a mother in a market town eyeing a stall selling wastel bread. The fine white loaves made of sifted wheat, reserved for the nobility. She cannot afford it. It costs twice as much as her coarse loaf. But perhaps on a saint's day, she buys a honey cake or a single ripe pear for her child. The joy on the child's face is radiant, a burst of sweetness in a savory grey world. Food is not just fuel. It is the primary language of care. When a parent gives a child the last piece of bacon fat to suck on, it is an act of sacrificial love as profound as any sonnet. As the meal ends, the wooden bowls are wiped clean with the last of the bread. Nothing is wasted. The child's belly is full for now, but the nutritional deficits are ticking time bombs. The lack of vitamin D from the long, dark winters bends their legs with rickets. The lack of vitamin C loosens their teeth with scurvy. They are growing, but they are growing against the wind. The meal is over, the fire is banked, and the child steps out into the muddy lane. They have fuel in their blood now, enough to face the day, but the weakened defenses of their body, compromised by the hungry gap and the coarse diet, have opened the door for the next great antagonist of our story. The invisible armies are gathering in the air, in the water, and in the touch of a stranger. The stomach is quiet, but the fever is coming. It begins in the dead of night, piercing the silence of the sleeping house like a cracked bell. A cough, dry and rattling, or a sudden sharp cry of pain that pulls the parents from their exhaustion into instant adrenaline-fueled wakefulness. In the modern world, a fever is a concern, a reason to reach for a plastic bottle of syrup and a thermometer. In the medieval world, a fever is a visitation. It is a shadowy figure standing at the foot of the bed, demanding a contest of wills. As the mother rushes to the cradle or the pallet where the siblings sleep, huddled together for warmth, she touches a forehead that burns with a dry, unnatural heat. The enemy has breached the walls. The invisible armies of bacteria and viruses, emboldened by the child's winter-weakened constitution, have taken hold. And so begins the terrifying intimacy of the sick room, a drama played out in millions of cottages and castles across the centuries. The immediate reaction is a flurry of practical and spiritual defense. The windows, already small, are sealed even tighter to keep out the miasma, the bad air believed to carry disease. The fire is stoked, not just for warmth, but to purify the room. To our modern eyes, the scene is suffocating: smoke, heat, and darkness, the very conditions that might worsen a respiratory infection. But they are working with the map of the body they have, a map drawn by the ancient Greeks and filtered through centuries of folklore. They believe the child's body is a vessel of 4 fluids, or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Sickness is not an invasion of germs. It is an imbalance of these fluids, a chaotic storm within the skin. To cure the child, the balance must be restored. If the child is flushed and feverish, they are deemed to have too much blood. If they are pale and cold, too much phlegm. For the peasant family, there is no expensive university-trained physician in a velvet robe to consult. Their doctor is the village wise woman, or perhaps the local priest, or simply the collective memory of the grandmother. The medicine cabinet is the garden and the hedgerow. We watch the mother grinding herbs in a mortar, the rhythmic thump, 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 acting as a counterpoint to the child's labored breathing. She might prepare a syrup of horehound and honey for a cough, a remedy that actually works and is still found in throat lozenges today. Or she might brew a tea of willow bark to bring down the fever, a primitive, natural form of aspirin. These are the triumphs of folk medicine, the result of centuries of trial and error. But desperation also breeds stranger, darker cures. If the fever is stubborn, the remedies drift from the botanical to the bizarre. A popular treatment for whooping cough involves holding a live spider over the child's head in a walnut shell, or perhaps feeding the child a soup made from boiled snails to soothe the throat. One can only imagine the negotiation required to get a nauseous toddler to eat snail broth, a parenting challenge that transcends time. Historians still debate the efficacy of these treatments. For years, it was fashionable to dismiss medieval medicine as pure superstition, a horror show of leeches and prayer. But recent analysis of medieval medical texts, like the Ball's Leech Book, has shown that some concoctions, specifically those using garlic, onion, and ox bile in brass vessels, had potent antibiotic properties capable of killing MRSA. They didn't know why it worked, but they knew it did. However, for every effective garlic salve, there was a dangerous placebo. We might see a parent place a piece of parchment inscribed with the words abracadabra, or a prayer to Saint Blaise around the child's neck. This is an amulet, a shield of faith against the biological storm. If the child is suffering from the king's evil, scrofula, a form of tuberculosis, the only known cure is the touch of the monarch himself, a logistical impossibility for a serf in rural Yorkshire, leaving them to rely on the touch of a seventh son of a seventh son instead. The atmosphere in the room is heavy, with the scent of vinegar and rose water sprinkled to freshen the air, and the acrid smell of sickness itself. The parents take turns sitting vigil. This is the hardest work of all, the waiting. There are no monitors to beep, no nurses to check vitals. There is only the rise and fall of the chest, the flush of the cheek. They watch for the crisis, the turning point where the humors will either settle or overwhelm the child. It is a moment of profound helplessness. A father, perhaps a man who can fell an oak tree or shoe a horse, sits by the bed, his large, rough hands useless against an enemy he cannot see or strike. He might vow a pilgrimage if the child survives, promising to walk barefoot to the nearest shrine, a transaction of pain for life. Pain management is primitive. For a toothache, a common agony in a world with grit in the bread, the child might have the tooth rubbed with clove oil, or in severe cases, burned out with a hot wire. For an earache, warm urine, often from a virgin boy for purity, might be poured into the ear. It sounds revulsive, but urine is sterile and warm. It might have actually provided some relief from the pressure, even if the virgin part was chemically irrelevant. We see the child drift in and out of delirium, their dreams filled with the confused imagery of their limited world. Monsters from the church paintings, the heat of the bakery, the face of the frightened dog. And then, there are the diseases that have no cure, the ones that carry names like bells tolling, smallpox, measles, diphtheria. If the speckled monster, smallpox, enters the house, the fear is absolute. If the child survives, they will likely be scarred for life, their face a map of the battle they fought. If they do not, the grief begins before the breath stops. The priest is called for the last rites, the extreme unction. He anoints the small eyelids, the ears, the hands with oil, preparing the soul for a journey far longer than any earthly travel. The room fills with the murmur of Latin, a language the child does not speak but understands as the sound of holiness. But let us hold on to the light. In our story, the crisis passes. The fever breaks in a sweat that soaks the straw mattress. The child opens their eyes, clear and cool for the first time in days. The relief in the room is a physical weight lifting, a sudden intake of breath. The mother weeps, not from sorrow, but from the release of a terror held too tight for too long. They offer the child a sip of watered wine or warm milk. The invalid is weak, their legs wobbly as a newborn falls, but the hunger has returned, a sure sign of life. The parents know this is a victory, but a temporary one. The invisible army has retreated, but it is always camped at the edge of the village. Recovery is slow. There is no concept of bed rest for weeks. As soon as the child can stand, they are reintegrated into the flow of daily life, though perhaps spared the heaviest chores. They sit by the door, wrapped in a blanket, watching the dust motes dance in the sun. It is in this convalescence, this quiet pause between the terror of death and the drudgery of work, that the child rediscovers the world. The colors seem brighter, the sounds sharper. And as strength returns to their limbs, a natural, unstoppable impulse begins to bubble up from within. It is the impulse that defines childhood, even in the darkest of ages. The need to move, to imagine, to mimic. The fever has burned away the fog, and what is left is the desire to play. The child reaches for a smooth stone, a stick, or a piece of bone, and transforms it. The sick room is left behind. It is time for knucklebones in the dust. The fever has retreated, leaving behind a frail but ravenous hunger for life, and the child steps out of the gloom of the cottage into the blinding, dusty brilliance of the village day. It is here, in the lanes between the wattle fences and the shadow of the church tower, that we witness the most resilient miracle of medieval childhood, the refusal to stop playing. Despite the crushing weight of survival, the looming threat of disease, and the constant demand for labor, the spirit of the child insists on joy. It is a biological imperative, a bright green shoot pushing through the heavy paving stones of hardship. But play in the Middle Ages is not the sanitized, plastic-coated experience of the modern nursery. It is raw, organic, and deeply connected to the earth itself. The primary toy of this era is not bought, it is butchered. We look down at the dirt, packed hard by generations of feet, and see a group of children crouched in a circle, their eyes narrowed in concentration. They are playing knucklebones. The pieces they toss are the astragale, the ankle bones of sheep or pigs, saved from the dinner pot, boiled clean, and polished by hours of handling. To us, they are grisly remnants of a carcass. To them, they are precious jewels of chance. The game is a precursor to modern jacks, a rhythmic test of dexterity where the bones are thrown up and caught on the back of the hand. The sound of bone clicking against bone is the soundtrack of the medieval street, a percussive rhythm that echoes across centuries. It is a game that costs nothing but requires everything: skill, luck, and the daring to gamble a prized marble or a shiny pebble. Historians and archaeologists have long debated the nature of medieval toys, with some earlier scholars arguing that the lack of surviving artifacts meant children were treated as miniature adults, with no time for frivolity. But the mud tells a different story. In the silt of the River Thames and the cesspits of Nuremberg, we have found the truth. We find tiny pewter knights, mass-produced in molds, their lances bent by imaginary battles. We find dolls made of fired clay or carved wood, some with articulated limbs, waiting to be dressed in scraps of linen. These were not ritual objects. They were loved, dropped, broken, and mourned. But for the peasant child, the toy shop is the forest and the scrap heap. A hobby horse is simply a sturdy stick, perhaps with a crude head carved at one end and a leather rein attached. Yet straddling this stick, a serf's son becomes a knight, galloping not through pig muck, but across the fields of chivalry. A doll might be nothing more than a bundle of rags tied with twine, or a wooden spoon with a face charcoaled onto the scoop, but it is cradled with a tenderness that rehearses the very real, very imminent role of parenthood. The games themselves are often rough, reflecting the violence of the world around them. We watch a game of Hoodman Blind, the ancestor of Blind Man's Buff. One child is hoodwinked, blindfolded with a hood pulled backward, while the others shove, buffet, and tease them, striking them with knotted cloths. It is chaotic and physically aggressive, a way of learning to take a hit and keep moving. There is mob football, too, played with an inflated pig's bladder encased in leather. This is not a game of manicured pitches and offside rules. It is a sprawling, village-wide brawl where the goal might be a mile away and the only rule is to get the ball there by any means necessary. Broken noses and bruised shins are the trophies of a good match. It is here, in the scrum and the chase, that the communal bonds of the village are forged. They learn to rely on each other, to move as a pack, a skill that will be essential when they are grown and harvesting wheat in a line or standing in a shield wall. The setting for this play is often surprising to the modern mind. The churchyard, with its lich gate and uneven ground, is the primary playground. In a world where death is a neighbor, the graveyard is not a place of spooky prohibition, but a center of community life. Children play tag among the wooden crosses and unmarked mounds, their laughter ringing out over the bones of their ancestors. There is no disrespect intended. It is simply that the dead are still part of the village, and life must continue in their presence. We might see a priest shooing them away from the church porch, not because play is sinful, but because they are making too much noise during Vespers. It is a poignant juxtaposition, the vibrancy of new life running literally over the decay of the old. Winter brings its own savage joys. When the ponds freeze, the children of the medieval North do not retreat indoors. They strap the shin bones of horses or cattle to their feet, nature's ice skates, and use iron-tipped poles to propel themselves across the grey ice. It is a frictionless flight, a rare moment of speed and freedom in a life that is otherwise slow and earthbound. The cold bites their faces, redness blooming on their cheeks, but the thrill of the glide is worth the frostbite. They build snowmen too, though medieval illustrations often show these snow figures as grotesque or monstrous, perhaps reflecting the fears of the long dark rather than the whimsy of Frosty. They throw snowballs with lethal accuracy, sieging snow forts that mimic the castles they will never live in, but whose authority they feel every day. Yet, even in play, there is a shadow. Play is rarely just for fun. It is almost always a rehearsal for labor. The girl with her rag doll is learning the hold that will comfort her own babies in a few years. The boy with the wooden sword is building the wrist strength he will need for the scythe or the axe. They make mud pies, not just to get dirty, but to mimic the baker. They weave garlands of daisies to mimic the weaver. The adult world is not separate. It is the reference point for every game. There is no fantasy of being a superhero or a wizard. The fantasy is to be a successful, strong adult who can feed their family. They play at what they must become, and they must become it soon. As the sun begins to dip lower, casting long, melancholy shadows across the village green, we sense a shift in the wind. The children are getting older. The toddler who survived the fire, the boy who recovered from the fever, the girl who mastered the knucklebones, they are approaching a definitive boundary line. In the medieval, legal and theological mind, the age of 7 is a cliff edge. It is the pueritia, the end of infancy, and the beginning of the age of reason. The church teaches that before 7, a child is innocent, incapable of mortal sin, because they cannot truly understand right from wrong. They are wild things, tolerated and protected. But at 7, the clock strikes. The soul becomes accountable. The mind is deemed ready for instruction, for discipline, and for the heavy yoke of duty. The toys are not necessarily thrown away, but they are put down more often. The hobby horse leans forgotten against the barn wall. The knucklebones collect dust in a pouch. The laughter of the churchyard begins to fade replaced by the deeper, more serious tones of instruction. The free, feral days of early childhood are ending. The golden hour is over. The child stands at the edge of the playground, looking toward the fields, the workshops, and the cold stone walls of the schoolroom. They are about to step into the world of consequences. The parents watch them with a mix of pride and sorrow, knowing that the next phase will demand more than just survival. It will demand submission. The carefree chaos of the dust is settling. The time for play is done. The time for the harvest of crops, of souls, of duty has begun. The sun has not set, but the quality of the light has changed. It is no longer the soft, diffused glow of morning, but the stark, revealing clarity of noon. We have arrived at the invisible line drawn across the timeline of every medieval life, the seventh birthday. In the modern world, turning 7 is a celebration of cake and perhaps a new bicycle, a milestone marked by a slightly harder math homework. But in the Middle Ages, the number 7 is heavy with mystical and legal significance. It is the number of the days of creation, the number of the sacraments, and the number of the deadly sins. It is the gateway to the Aetas Rationalis, the age of reason. The child who woke up yesterday as an infans, a being whose soul was considered dormant and whose sins were washed away by the innocence of ignorance, wakes up today as a moral agent. The Church declares that the distinct biological window of childhood is not over, but the spiritual amnesty has ended. They now possess the cognitive ability to distinguish right from wrong, and therefore they possess the terrifying capacity to sin. The psychological weight of this transition is immense. We watch a 7-year-old boy standing in the nave of the village church, his small hands clasped white-knuckled in prayer. He is preparing for his first confession. The air smells of beeswax and damp stone, a sensory memory that will stay with him for the rest of his life. He must now search his own heart, not for the simple errors of a child, spilling the milk or pulling the cat's tail, but for the darker impulses of the soul, envy, anger, greed. It is a profound burden to place on such narrow shoulders. The priest, looming in the shadows of the confessional or sitting on a bench in the corner, is no longer just a benevolent figure who sprinkles holy water. He is the judge. The child whispers his transgressions, his voice trembling. He learns that his private thoughts are no longer private. They are subject to divine scrutiny. This is the moment the internal surveillance system of the medieval mind is switched on. Historians and theologians have long discussed how this early introduction to introspection shaped the medieval psyche, creating a culture deeply obsessed with guilt, penance, and the terrifying geography of the afterlife. The child is no longer just a body to be fed. He is a soul to be saved, and the stakes are eternal. Parents look at their 7-year-old with a new kind of anxiety. If the child dies now, without confession, the path to heaven is no longer guaranteed by baptism alone. The spiritual safety net has been removed, but the transformation is not just spiritual. It is visibly, physically sartorial. For boys, this age often marks the ritual of preaching. Until now, both boys and girls have likely worn long, loose tunics, simple gowns that are easy to make and easier to clean. They are gender-neutral garments of childhood. But at 7, the boy is separated from the world of women. He is taken by his father or a male relative and dressed for the first time in breeches or hose, separate leggings that join at the waist. It is a clumsy process. We might chuckle softly at the sight of a boy tugging at these new restrictive garments, walking with a stiff-legged gait, as if he has suddenly forgotten how his knees work. The breeches itch, they bind, and they require a belt. He looks like a miniature man, ridiculous and proud all at once. It is a public declaration that he is leaving the nursery. He is stepping out of the sphere of the mother's influence and into the sphere of the father's authority. He is being drafted into the patriarchy, ready or not. For the girl, the change is subtler, but equally restrictive. She does not get breeches. She gets the veil, or at least the expectation of modesty. Her hair, perhaps allowed to flow free in the wind during her earlier years, is now braided, bound, or covered with a simple coif or kerchief. The message is clear. She is approaching womanhood, and womanhood in the Middle Ages is a state of being enclosed. She is being taught that her beauty is a danger, something to be managed and guarded. She is not yet marriageable. That terror is still 5 or 6 years away. But she is being prepped for the market. Her sphere remains the domestic, but the nature of her presence there changes. She is no longer a pet to be indulged, but a lieutenant to be commanded. She stands by the hearth not to play with the ashes, but to learn the exact temperature required to bake the bread without burning the crust. This is also the moment where the myth of the miniature adult is most often debated. In the 1960s, the historian Philippe Ariès famously argued that medieval society did not have a concept of childhood as we know it, that once a child turned 7, they were simply seen as small adults, drinking beer and working full jobs. Modern scholarship has softened this view significantly. We know now that medieval law and culture recognized that a 7-year-old was still vulnerable, still growing, and legally underage, a concept that certainly existed. They could not sign contracts. They could not inherit property fully, and in the eyes of the law, they were still pupilli, wards. However, they were certainly not kids in the modern sense of being shielded from reality. There was no tween phase, no adolescence of rebellion and discovery. There was the child, and then there was the worker. The transition was a gradient, but a steep one. At 7, the social separation begins in earnest. If the boy is of noble birth, this is the age he might be sent away from home entirely, fostered in the household of a superior lord to serve as a page. He leaves his mother, his nurse, and his familiar bed to sleep on a pallet in a stranger's hall, learning to pour wine, polish armor, and take a beating without crying. It is a brutal severance of the emotional bond, justified by the belief that parents are too soft to properly discipline their own sons. For the peasant boy, he does not leave home, but he leaves the house. He follows his father to the fields. He is given a stick to beat the oxen or a bag of stones to throw at crows. He is useful. The word is the highest compliment a medieval child can receive. To be useful is to justify the food you eat. The girl, meanwhile, begins her apprenticeship in the endless circular labor of the household. She learns to spin wool, a task that requires nimble, small fingers and infinite patience. She learns to milk the cow, her cheek pressed against the warm, hairy flank of the beast, learning the rhythm that brings the milk down. She becomes the secondary mother to her younger siblings, hauling babies who are nearly as heavy as she is. There is a solemnity to her now. The wild laughter of the churchyard is replaced by the quiet concentration of the loom. She is learning that her value lies in her industry and her chastity. We see the 7-year-old standing at the doorway of the cottage, looking out. Behind them lies the chaotic, warm, dangerous freedom of infancy. Ahead lies the structured, demanding, relentless world of the adult. They are small, their faces still round, with the last traces of babyhood, but their eyes are older. They have made their first confession. They have worn their first real clothes. They have performed their first real work. The age of reason has dawned, cold and clear. They understand now that life is not a game of knucklebones, but a ledger of debts. Debts to God, debts to the Lord, and debts to the soil. And the soil is waiting. The harvest does not plant itself, and the weeds do not sleep. As the church bell tolls the hour, calling the village to prayer and to work, the child steps over the threshold. The nursery is closed. The fields are open. The education of the peasant child, written in mud and sweat, is about to begin. The door of the cottage opens, not to a paved street or a fenced garden, but to the vast, rolling expanse of the open field system. This is the true schoolroom of the medieval peasant child, a classroom without walls, where the ceiling is the shifting grey sky and the floor is the living, breathing soil. Having crossed the threshold of 7 years, the child is no longer a passive consumer of the harvest. They have become an active participant in its creation. We watch them step into the mud, the cold, clinging earth that will define the rest of their existence. The education here is tactile and brutal. There are no textbooks, only the stubborn resistance of weeds and the heavy, wet weight of the soil. The first lesson is solitude. We see a young boy, perhaps 8 years old, sent out to the edge of the wheat field. He carries a wooden clapper or a bag of stones. His job is bird scaring. It sounds almost whimsical, like a nursery rhyme task. But in reality, it is a test of profound endurance. He must stay there from dawn until dusk, alone, scanning the sky for the black silhouettes of crows and rooks that threaten the family's survival. If he fails, if he falls asleep in the warm sun and the birds descend to strip the grain, the family starves. It is a crushing responsibility for a mind that still drifts easily into daydreams. He shouts until his throat is raw, runs until his legs burn, and learns the harsh lesson that nature is not a friend, but a competitor. He invents songs to fill the silence, talks to the stones, and perhaps carves a piece of wood with a crude knife. This is the origin of the lonely shepherd archetype, born not of romance, but of the crushing boredom of the watch. But not all work is solitary. As the season turns, the labor becomes communal, a rhythmic dance of backs and hands. We see the girls and younger boys moving down the rows of growing crops, their task, weeding. It is backbreaking work. The medieval field is not a monoculture. It is a battleground where thistles, charlock, and docks fight the barley for sunlight. The child must learn to distinguish friend from foe instantly, pulling the intruder by the root without disturbing the shallow hold of the grain. Their hands become stained green and brown, calloused and scratched. Historians and osteologists, the scientists who study bones, have looked at the skeletons of medieval teenagers and found the story of this labor written in calcium. They find evidence of Schmall's nodes, depressions in the vertebrae caused by heavy lifting and constant bending at a young age. These children literally shaped their bodies to fit the plow and the hoe. Their spines carried the weight of the harvest before they had fully finished growing. Yet, historians still argue whether this was viewed as exploitation in the modern sense or simply inevitable socialization. To the medieval parent, keeping a child from work would not be a kindness. It would be a failure to prepare them for reality. A child who could not work was a child who had no future. We move from the fields to the common land, the rough pasture at the edge of the village. Here, we find the children who tend the livestock. The goose girl of fairy tales stands here, but she is not a princess in disguise. She is a muddy-hemmed child holding a stick, facing down a flock of geese, animals that are surprisingly aggressive, hissing dinosaurs with feathers that can bruise a shin or bite a finger. She must guide them to water and back, ensuring none are stolen by a fox or a wandering thief. The shepherd boy, slightly older, watches the sheep. This is a job of higher status, for wool is the golden fleece of the medieval economy, the export that builds cathedrals. But the danger is real. Wolves are not myths in the medieval forest. They are apex predators that watch from the tree line. The boy must be vigilant, armed only with a sling and his voice. He learns to read the weather in the behavior of the flock, to know that when the sheep huddle, a storm is coming. He learns the geography of the hills better than any map maker. He is part of the landscape, a small, still figure against the green. And then comes the climax of the agricultural year, the harvest. This is the all-hands-on-deck moment, the time when the distinction between child and adult, male and female, almost dissolves in the face of urgent necessity. The wheat is ripe, and the rain is coming. Every hour matters. The men wield the scythes, cutting the grain in great rhythmic sweeps, a wall of sharp iron moving across the field. The women follow to bind the sheaves. The children are everywhere. They are the runners, fetching water and ale for the thirsty reapers. They are the gatherers, rushing to bundle the fallen stalks before they can be trampled. The air is filled with dust, the golden chaff that coats the skin and fills the lungs. It is hot, itchy, exhausting work. We watch a 10-year-old girl lifting a sheaf of wheat that weighs nearly as much as she does, struggling to stack it on the wagon. There is a frantic energy to the work, a mix of anxiety and celebration. If they get the crop in, they live. If they don't, winter will be a tomb. The children feel this anxiety. They absorb it through the tension in their parents' shoulders. When the wagons finally creak away, laden with the golden treasure, the fields are left stubbled and bare. But the work of the child is not done. Now begins the gleaning. This is a biblical rite, enshrined in medieval custom and law, allowing the poor, the elderly, and the children to scour the fields for any ears of grain the reapers missed. It is a scavenger hunt for survival. We see the children crawling on their hands and knees, combing through the sharp stubble, their eyes sharp for a single stalk of barley. Every grain collected is ground into flour. Every handful is a loaf of bread for February. It is a lesson in the value of the smallest things. Nothing is wasted. The gleaning might last for days until the field is picked clean as a bone. There is a camaraderie here, too. The children work in gangs, sharing the gossip of the village, learning the songs that regulate the rhythm of the work. They hear the adults talking about the Lord's unfair taxes, about the miller who cheats on the weight, about the strange lights seen in the churchyard. They are absorbing the oral history of their community. They learn the boundaries of their world, which stream marks the edge of the parish, which woods are safe and which are haunted or forbidden by the king's foresters. They learn the names of every plant, which ones heal a cut, which ones make a dye, and which ones will stop a heart. This botanical knowledge is not academic. It is visceral. They know the natural world with an intimacy that we have lost. They know the smell of rain before it falls. They know the sound of a badger moving in the undergrowth. As the sun sets, painting the sky in bruised purples and reds, the children trudge home. They are filthy, their skin caked with mud and sweat, their muscles trembling with fatigue. They do not need to be told to go to bed. Sleep is a biological imperative that overtakes them often before they finish their supper. They have contributed, they have earned their place in the household. They are not just mouths to feed, they are hands that feed. There is a pride in that, a quiet, stoic dignity that forms the bedrock of their character. They are peasant children, yes, but they are also the engine of the medieval economy. Without their small hands weeding the furrows and herding the geese, the great wheel of feudalism would grind to a halt. They drift into a deep, dreamless sleep, the smell of the earth still in their nostrils. But not all children sleep in the silence of the countryside, far away within the cramped, walled embrace of the growing towns. A different kind of childhood is unfolding, one of noise, sparks, and the strict hierarchy of the guild. The fields are left behind for the workshop, where the air is thick not with pollen, but with sawdust and ambition. Leave the expansive silence of the moonlit fields behind, where the wind whispers through the barley, and step with me now through the heavy, iron-bound gates of the medieval city. The air here changes instantly. It thickens, tasting not of clean earth and rain, but of coal smoke, roasting meat, unwashed bodies, and the sharp, acidic tang of industry. We have entered the labyrinth of the town, London, Paris, Florence, or perhaps a bustling wool town in Flanders. Here the childhood of the open sky is traded for the childhood of the workshop, a world of sparks, sawdust, and strict vertical hierarchies. If the peasant child's life is dictated by the sun and the seasons, the urban child's life is ruled by the bell and the guild. We float down a narrow cobblestone street where the upper stories of the timber-framed houses lean in so close they almost touch, blotting out the stars, creating a canyon of shadows. It is here, in the cramped ground-floor workshops, that we find the apprentice. He is likely older than our 7-year-old bird-scarer, perhaps 10 or 12, but his transition to adulthood is even more legally binding. He has not just been sent to work, he has been signed over. We witness the signing of the indenture. This is a solemn, terrifying moment for a child. The father and the master of the craft stand before a notary or a guild official. A contract is drawn up, detailing the terms. The master will provide food, shelter, clothing, and the mysteries of the trade. In return, the boy promises obedience, chastity, and total labor. He is forbidden from marrying, gambling, or frequenting taverns. The document is then cut in a jagged, wavy line, a tooth or indentation, so that the two halves can be fitted together later to prove authenticity. With the tearing of that parchment, the boy's life as a free agent ends. He belongs to the workshop. He watches his parents walk away, disappearing into the crowd, and turns to face a stranger who now holds the power of a father, a teacher, and a judge over his body and soul. The reality of apprenticeship is rarely the romanticized sorcerer's apprentice montage of magical brooms. It is a grind, For the first few years, the apprentice is little more than a glorified servant. He sweeps the shavings, fetches the water, scrubs the pots, and runs errands through the dangerous, muck-filled streets. He is the low man on a very tall totem pole, subject to the whims of the master, the mistress, and the older bullying journeymen who take out their frustrations on him. We see him in a carpenter's shop, standing ankle-deep in curly shavings of oak and elm. The air is filled with the rhythmic shh, shh of the plane and the percussive thud of the mallet. He is learning to know wood, not by looking at a tree, but by the grain of a plank. He learns to sharpen a chisel until it can shave the hair off his arm, a lesson often learned at the cost of his own blood. There is no OSHA here. If he slices a tendon or loses a finger to a slipped saw, he is simply a broken tool, likely to be dismissed and cast into beggary. The workshop is a hazardous playground. In the smithy, the danger is elemental. The heat is a physical wall. The apprentice works the bellows, pumping air into the forge until his arms scream with lactic acid, staring into the heart of the fire. He learns to judge the temperature of the iron by its color, cherry red, white hot, knowing that a mistake means a ruined piece and a beating. Sparks fly like angry hornets, singing his hair and scarring his leather apron. He breathes in coal dust and metal filings day after day. Historians and medical archaeologists studying the remains of urban medieval populations often find black lung or metal poisoning in skeletons that are barely out of their teens, a grim testament to the toxicity of these trades. But the flawless lot falls to the tanner's apprentice. We find him on the outskirts of the city, for the smell of his trade is too offensive for the center. Tanning leather requires breaking down the animal hide with caustic substances. The apprentice stands knee-deep in vats of urine collected from the city and pure, a polite name for dog feces gathered from the streets. He must trample the skins with his bare feet to work the enzymes into the leather. The stench is indescribable, a permanent cloak that ensures he has no friends outside his trade. He is chemically burning his own skin to preserve the skin of a dead cow. Yet, even here, there is a pride. He is part of a mystery, a secret knowledge that turns rot into durability. The domestic life of the apprentice is equally complex. He lives in the master's house, often sleeping on a pallet under the counter of the shop, or in a drafty attic with the other boys. He eats at the master's table, but often below the salt, receiving the gristlier cuts of meat. He is technically family, but a second-class member. The master's wife, the mistress, is a pivotal figure in his life. She might be a motherly protector who sneaks him extra bread, or she might be a tyrant who treats him as a scullery slave. The line between education and exploitation is razor thin. Historians still argue about the level of systemic abuse in the apprenticeship system. Court records are full of cases where parents sued masters for beating a boy too hard or failing to teach him the trade, proving that while harsh discipline was the norm, there were limits. A broken bone was a breach of contract. A bruise was just a lesson. Yet, the city offers a different kind of freedom than the fields. On feast days and Sundays, the apprentice gangs roam the streets. They are a notorious social force, rowdy, loud, and tribal. They wear the blue coat of their station like a uniform. They play football in the narrow lanes, shattering shutters and terrorizing chickens. They engage in street wars with apprentices from rival guilds. butchers fighting bakers, cordwainers fighting glovers. If the city has a university, the town versus gown, riots between apprentices and students are legendary, often resulting in genuine violence. It is a release of the pent-up energy of confined, repetitive labor. In the anonymity of the crowd, the apprentice finds a voice he cannot use in the workshop. We must not forget the girls. While the formal apprenticeship system is male-dominated, girls are also bound out, often to the silk trade, embroidery, or as servants in husbandry, who are effectively apprentices in domestic management. In the silk workshops of London or the brewing houses of alley wives, girls work with nimble fingers and strong backs. Their labor is often less documented, but no less skilled. A girl learning to weave gold thread into velvet is mastering a technology as complex as any blacksmith's forge. But her path to mastery is blocked. She can rarely become a guild master herself, usually destined to work under a husband or father. As the years pass, the apprentice grows. The clumsy boy who swept the floor is now a broad-shouldered youth who can wield the hammer with precision. He is approaching the end of his term. 7 years is the standard. He begins to dream of his masterpiece. This is not a metaphor. It is a literal requirement. To graduate from apprentice to journeyman, one who is paid by the journey or day, and eventually to master, he must produce a single object that proves his skill to the guild wardens. A perfect shoe, a seamless barrel, a flawlessly forged lock. It is the final exam of his childhood. But tonight, the masterpiece is still a distant dream. The curfew bell, couvre-feu, cover the fire, rings out from the church tower, signaling the end of the day. The city gates are locked. The fires in the forges are banked down to glowing coals. The apprentice lies on his straw mat, the smell of sawdust or iron filings clinging to his skin. He is tired, his hands are blistered, and his back aches. But he is not just a laborer. He is a man in the making. He possesses a skill that no one can take away from him. In a world of chaos, he is learning to create order. He closes his eyes, the noise of the city fading to a dull hum, unaware that, across town, in the cold, candlelit silence of a monastery, another kind of child is awake, not shaping wood or iron, but shaping the very words of God on the page. The workshop of the hand gives way to the workshop of the mind. The heavy oak door of the workshop slams shut, cutting off the sparks and the shouting, and we cross a threshold into a world where the air is not choked with coal dust, but chilled by damp stone and scented with the acrid tang of oak gall ink. We have entered the cloister, the cathedral school, the silent engine room of the medieval mind. Here, we find a childhood that is statistically rare. Perhaps only 5% of the population will ever learn to read, but culturally immense. This is the domain of the oblate and the scholar. The silence here is not empty. It is heavy, pressurized, governed by the strict rhythm of the horarium, the monastic timetable. We spot a young boy, perhaps 7 or 8, shivering in the pre-dawn gloom. He is an oblatus, a child offered up by his parents to the monastery, a living tithe given to God just as one might give a portion of the harvest. He will likely never see his family again. He is now a son of the order. He stands in a row of other boys, their breath pluming in the freezing air. Heating is considered a luxury of the flesh, and the flesh must be mortified. They are chanting the psalms for matins, their voices high and pure, bouncing off the vaulted ceiling. They are sleep-deprived, having been roused from their straw pallets at 2 a.m. If a boy nods off, or if his mind wanders to the memory of his mother's face, a monk patrols the rows with a lantern and a rod, ready to administer a sharp, stinging reminder that attention is a form of prayer. The education that follows sunrise is not the gentle discovery of learning. It is a siege on the mind. The centerpiece of this world is the scriptorium or the schoolroom, a place of intense physical discipline. We often romanticize the medieval scribe, imagining a peaceful monk illuminating a manuscript in a sunbeam. The reality for the child student is physical agony. Writing is not a wrist movement. It is a full-body exertion. 3 fingers hold the pen, the saying goes, but the whole body labors. We watch the boy hunched over a desk that is too high, his feet dangling or resting on freezing straw. He is learning to write on a wax tablet with a stylus, a bone or metal spike. It is the medieval iPad, erasable and practical. Only when he has mastered the form will he be trusted with parchment or vellum. Vellum is not paper, it is skin. It is the scraped, stretched hide of a calf or a sheep. It smells of the slaughterhouse when damp, and it is expensive. A mistake here is not just an error. It is a waste of livestock. To prepare the surface, the boy must rub it with pumice and chalk until his fingers bleed. The ink he uses is a chemical brew of iron salts and oak galls, tumors from oak trees. Acidic enough to burn into the skin, it stains his hands black, a mark of his trade that soap cannot easily remove. The pedagogy is brutal. The maxim of the medieval classroom is qui parcit virge odit filium. He who spares the rod hates his son. Physical pain is considered an essential tool for memory. If a boy forgets a declension or stammers over a conjugation, the birch rod descends. There is a terrifying logic to it. The pain creates a somatic marker, searing the lesson into the brain through trauma. We see a master teaching Latin grammar, the Donatus, holding a bundle of birch twigs like a scepter. He does not strike out of anger, but out of duty. The ears of a boy are on his back, the proverb says. He hears when he is beaten. St. Augustine, looking back on his own education, famously wrote that he feared the teacher's rod more than he feared death itself. It is a childhood of constant, low-level terror, where the fear of punishment is the primary motivator for intellectual growth. And yet, there is a strange, desperate camaraderie among the boys. They develop their own sign language to communicate silently behind the master's back, signals for pass the stylus, I'm hungry, or the abbot is coming. They are prisoners of privilege, trapped in a stone vessel of knowledge. The curriculum itself is the trivium, grammar, logic, and rhetoric. It is abstract, rigorous, and entirely in Latin. The boy is forced to think in a language that is not his mother tongue, a dead language that is paradoxically the only living key to power, law, and scripture. He is hacking the code of the universe, but there is no science, no geography, no history as we know it. He learns that the world is flat or round, depending on the theological interpretation, that hyenas change their gender annually, and that pelicans feed their young with their own blood. He memorizes the Psalms until they are burned into his neural pathways, a mental library he will carry forever. We see him struggling with computers, the complex, maddening mathematics of calculating the date of Easter. It involves lunar cycles and solar calendars, a mental gymnastic that would baffle a modern calculus student, all done without the number 0, using clumsy Roman numerals. MCML XXXXVIII is a lot harder to multiply than 1988. Scholars still debate the emotional state of the oblate. Was it a form of child abandonment? A way for noble families to disinherit surplus sons to keep the estate intact? Or was it the greatest gift a parent could give? A guaranteed ticket to salvation and social security. For the child, the theological nuance probably matters less than the cold. We see the physical toll in the skeletal remains of monks, fused vertebrae from years of hunching, weakened eyesight from straining in candlelight, and arthritic fingers. The filthy truth here is that the pursuit of holiness wrecked the body. The scriptorium was often unheated because fire risked burning the precious library. So, in the dead of winter, the boy writes with gloves that have the fingertips cut off, his breath fogging the page, his ink freezing in the horn. He suffers from chilblains, painful, itchy swelling on the skin caused by cold, that crack and bleed, and yet there is beauty. We watch the moment the boy is finally allowed to touch a real manuscript, perhaps a book of hours, glowing with gold leaf and lapis lazuli. He sees the grotesques or drolleries in the margins, little drawings of knights fighting snails or monkeys playing bagpipes. This is the soft humor of the medieval monk, a tiny rebellion of absurdity allowed in the margins of the sacred. The boy smiles, a rare crack in his serious demeanor. He realizes that even here, in this fortress of discipline, there is room for the human imagination to play. He is part of a chain of ink that stretches back to the ancients. He is becoming a custodian of the word, but the price is isolation. He is cut off from the rhythms of the village, the harvest, the fair, the tavern. He is being bred for a different species of adulthood. He will become the clerk, the priest, the lawyer, or the bishop. He will hold the power of life and death, not with a sword, but with a quill. As the compline bell rings, signaling the end of the day, the boy washes his inky fingers in a basin of cold water. He is exhausted. His back aches, and his ears sting from a boxing he received for daydreaming. He kneels on the stone floor, the cold seeping into his knees, and prays for his parents, whom he can barely remember. He is safe from the famine and the plough, but he is a captive of the cloister. He blows out his candle, plunging into a darkness as deep as the silence. But while he sleeps in his cell, dreaming of Latin verbs, another child is awake in a very different kind of room, a room hung with tapestries to block the drafts, where the fire roars in a giant hearth, and the danger comes not from a birch rod, but from a poisoned chalice or a political marriage. We leave the cold stone of the school for the velvet trap of the castle. The peasant child works, the scholar child prays, but the noble child must rule. We leave the ink-stained silence of the monastery and ascend the winding stone stairwell of the keep, rising above the smoke of the town to the rarefied, dangerous air of the nobility. Here, in the solar, the private living quarters of the lord and lady, the walls are hung with heavy arras tapestries depicting hunting scenes and mythical beasts. They are beautiful, yes, but they serve a grim practical purpose: to trap the heat and stop the draughts that whistle through the arrow loops. In this velvet-draped world, we find the noble child. To the peasant looking up from the mud, this life seems like a paradise of ease and plenty. But as we step closer, the illusion fractures. The noble child is not a person, they are a chess piece. They are the gilded cage generation, living in a paradox where they possess everything except ownership of their own lives. Their childhood is a high-stakes political thriller written in bloodlines and dowries. The first truth of the castle nursery is that the parents are often ghosts. The noble mother, whose primary duty is to provide a spare as well as an heir, is often in a perpetual cycle of pregnancy. She hands her infant over to a wet nurse immediately, a woman carefully screened for her health and moral character. For, as we know, the medievals believe character is transmitted through milk. A bwana, or rocking nurse, is employed just to rock the cradle, and a dry nurse handles the cleaning. The child grows up surrounded by a staff of servants who must obey them, yet control them. It is a confusing psychological landscape. A toddler who can command a grown man to fetch a toy, yet who must bow perfectly to a visiting bishop. They are miniature monarchs, indulged and spoiled, yet utterly powerless against the dynastic machinery that created them. For the noble boy, the clock of childhood stops abruptly at 7. He is rarely kept at home. In a practice known as fostering, he is packed off to the castle of a superior lord, an uncle, a patron, or a powerful ally. This is not abandonment, it is networking. He enters the household as a page. His education is a bizarre mix of domestic servitude and lethal combat training. We watch a 10-year-old boy dressed in silk and velvet that costs more than a peasant village earns in a year, pouring wine for his lord's guests. He must learn to carve meat with surgical precision. The carver is a high-ranking role, and to stand silent and invisible against the wall for hours. He is learning the art of service, for in the feudal system, everyone serves someone. But outside the great hall, the training turns brutal. The page must become a knight. We see him in the training yard, attacking the quinton, a rotating wooden dummy with a shield on one arm and a heavy sandbag on the other. If he strikes the shield too slowly, the arm spins around, and the sandbag whacks him in the back of the head, knocking him into the mud. The soldiers watching roar with laughter. It is a slapstick lesson in velocity. He trains with wooden swords that are weighted with lead to build muscle, far heavier than the real steel he will one day wield. Historians of osteology have found that the skeletons of medieval knights often show significant asymmetry. The right arm and shoulder are visibly thicker and more developed than the left, warped by years of swinging heavy iron from boyhood. This is not just exercise, it is the weaponization of the body. He learns to ride before he can read, and he learns to kill before he can kiss. For the noble girl, the cage is smaller and the bars are tighter. She is the peace weaver. Her value lies in her womb and her lineage. While her brother learns to break bones, she learns to manage the complex economy of a castle. She must know how to preserve food, how to spin and weave, even queens spun wool, and how to command a household of hundreds. She learns to read, often better than her brothers, for she will likely be the one reading the estate accounts while her husband is at war. But her body is also molded. She is dressed in stiff, structured garments that restrict movement, training her posture to be upright and rigid. We might see her learning to play the lute or the harp, not for the joy of music, but to increase her market value at court. She is being curated. The most chilling aspect of noble childhood is the concept of the whipping boy. This is a figure that sounds like a myth, but historical evidence suggests it had a basis in reality, particularly for royalty. The logic is twisted. The person of a prince is sacred, anointed by God. To strike him is a sin, so if the prince fails his Latin lesson or misbehaves, his companion, a boy of noble but lower rank who has been raised with him, is beaten in his place. We watch the prince standing by, watching his friend scream. The psychological damage here is double-edged. The victim learns that loyalty means suffering for another's mistakes, and the prince learns that his actions have consequences, but those consequences fall on others. It is a terrifying lesson in tyranny, designed to foster a perverse sense of guilt and responsibility. Though one wonders if it simply bred sociopathy. Health in the castle is a paradox. One might assume the rich are healthier, but the filthy truth is that they often suffer from diseases of affluence and confinement, while the peasant child runs in the sun, soaking up vitamin D. The noble child is often kept indoors to preserve their complexion and protect them from the bad air. We see evidence of rickets, soft bones, even in the skeletons of the Medici children in Renaissance Italy. They ate rich meats and drank wine, but lacked the vegetables and simple dairy of the poor. They were prone to gout and lead poisoning from the expensive glazed pottery and pewter plates they ate from. The castle itself is a stone trap. The garderobes, toilets, are essentially chutes that empty into the moat or a cesspit at the base of the wall. In summer, the smell rises up the shafts, filling the solar with methane and bacteria. Typhoid and dysentery do not check coats of arms at the door. And then there is the constant, shadowy threat of violence. A noble child is a hostage to fortune. During the Wars of the Roses or the 100 Years' War, children were routinely kidnapped, held for ransom, or besieged. We picture a 12-year-old girl standing on the battlements, watching her father's enemies burn the fields below. She knows that if the castle falls, she is a prize of war. There is no concept of civilians. If she is an heiress, she might be forcibly married at gunpoint or sword point to transfer her land to a rival. The story of the princes in the Tower, Edward V and his brother Richard, vanishing into the dark of the Tower of London, is the ultimate nightmare of noble childhood. Being born at the top is just a longer fall, yet there are moments of splendor. We see the Feast of the Boy Bishop, a chaotic inversion festival where a choir boy is elected bishop for a day, and the adults must obey him. It is a brief, sanctioned riot, a release valve for the strict pressure of hierarchy. We see the noble children playing with toys of exquisite craftsmanship, mechanical birds, dolls dressed in real silk, miniature suits of armor. But even these toys are preparing them for their roles. The armor is real. The doll is a fashion plate. As the sun sets over the battlements, the noble child retires to a bed hung with heavy curtains, sleeping on a mattress of down feathers, a luxury that breeds dust mites and asthma. They are warm, they are fed, and they are powerful. But as they drift to sleep, they can hear the murmuring of their parents discussing betrothals. A letter has arrived. The 7-year-old girl is to be promised to a 40-year-old duke in Burgundy. The 10-year-old boy is to be sent to the court of a king known for his temper. They are assets on a ledger. The castle walls are thick, designed to keep enemies out, but they are equally good at keeping the children in. they are safe from the wolf, but not from the wedding. The privilege of their birth is a golden chain, and as the candle flickers out, we realize that no matter the station, peasant, apprentice, monk, or prince, there is one visitor who ignores all boundaries, one shadow that darkens every doorway. The empty cradle is a universal furniture of the Middle Ages, the noise of the medieval world, the ring of the blacksmith's hammer, the shout of the field reapers, the Latin chant of the choir, the gossip of the market, fades away now. We enter a silence that is louder than any scream. It is a silence found in the corner of a peasant's hut, in the drafty solar of a duke's castle, and in the crowded tenements of the city. We stand before the empty cradle. This is the shadow that haunts every page of our story so far, the statistical monster that devours nearly half of all children before they reach puberty. But statistics are cold, and history is warm flesh and blood. We must confront one of the most persistent and damaging myths about the Middle Ages, the idea that because death was common, it was not felt. For decades, historians, following the lead of Philipparius, argued that medieval parents possessed an emotional callous, a defensive indifference to their children. They claimed that mothers and fathers did not invest love in their offspring until they were sure the child would survive, treating them like interchangeable units of production. All was forgotten as soon as the body was buried. They said, "Stand in this room, watching a mother rock a cradle that holds a corpse, and tell her she does not care." The historical record, when we listen to the whispers in the margins, screams against this apathy. We find the grief in the archaeology. Excavations of medieval churchyards reveal children buried with heartbreaking tenderness. In a grave in England, a little girl is found clutching a pet hazel dormouse. In Scandinavia, a boy is buried with his toy boat. These are not the actions of indifferent people. They are the desperate final acts of parents trying to send comfort into the dark. We read the letters of merchants and nobles stained with tears. We hear the agony of Martin Luther, though slightly later, his medieval mindset holds true. Writing on the death of his daughter, "I am so broken, my heart is bleeding." We read the anonymous poem Pearl, written by a father dreaming of his lost daughter in paradise, a masterpiece of grief that rivals any modern elegy. The filth and the danger did not deaden their hearts. If anything, the fragility of life made the love more fierce, more frantic. But the death itself is often swift and terrifying. One moment, the child is playing with a wooden sword. The next, the sweating sickness, or the bloody flux, has taken hold. The speed of contagion in a world without sanitation means that a family can lose 3 children in a week. We see the parents navigating a theological minefield that is almost as painful as the loss itself. The Church teaches that the unbaptized soul cannot enter heaven. It is relegated to limbus infantium, limbo. This is not hell. There is no fire, but there is no God. It is a place of eternal grey neutrality. For a medieval parent who believes in the beatific vision as the ultimate goal of existence, this is a horror beyond words. To think of their infant, who never sinned, exiled forever to the outer darkness, is a torture that keeps them awake at night. This fear drives one of the most poignant and desperate practices of the age, the respite shrine. We travel to a sanctuary in the French Alps or the English countryside. Here, parents bring the cold, stiff bodies of their stillborn or unbaptized babies. They lay them on the altar before the statue of the Virgin or a local saint. They pray with a ferocity that shakes the walls. They are begging for a sign of life, a flush of color in the cheek, a tiny movement of a feather placed on the lips, a single drop of warmth. They need the child to live for just 1 second, just long enough for the priest to sprinkle the water and say the words. If the miracle happens, and in the flickering candlelight, desperate eyes often see what they need to see. The child is baptized, and then, inevitably, dies again. But the soul is saved. The relief is overwhelming. They can bury their child in consecrated ground, knowing they will meet again. It is a loophole in the divine law, pried open by parental love. For those who do not get a miracle, the burial is a quiet tragedy. In the earlier medieval period, we find evidence of eave-strip burials. Infants were buried, not in the cemetery, but right up against the walls of the church, directly under the eaves of the roof. Why? So that every time it rained, the water running off the holy roof would fall upon their graves, a perpetual posthumous baptism from the heavens. It is a heartbreaking image. The parents trying to wash away the original sin with the tears of the sky, keeping their lost ones as close to the sanctuary as physically possible. But grief in the Middle Ages also has a darker, more superstitious shadow. When a child fails to thrive, when they become thin, pale, or disabled, the parents do not always blame biology. They blame the hidden people. The myth of the changeling is a powerful psychological tool for processing the inexplicable tragedy of developmental regression. We see a mother looking at her toddler, who was once bright and babbling, but has suddenly become silent and gaunt. She whispers that this is not her child. The fairies, or the elves, or the devil have stolen her healthy human baby and left this stock, this pale imitation, in its place. It sounds cruel to us, a rejection of a sick child, but in a twisted way, it is a coping mechanism. It allows the parents to believe their real child is alive somewhere, beautiful and happy in the fairy mound, rather than fading away in the dirt before their eyes. It externalizes the guilt. I didn't fail to feed him, he is a fairy thing. Tragically, the cures for a changeling are brutal, leaving the child on a dunghill overnight or holding them over a fire to force the spirits to take them back. It is the filthiest truth of all, that superstition, born of grief, could lead to abuse. Yet most grief is simply quiet endurance. We see the empty cradle, not put away, but simply pushed to the side. There is no time for a modern grieving period. The cows must be milked. The harvest must be brought in. The other children, the survivors, need food. The death of a child is a tear in the fabric of the family, but the fabric must be rewoven immediately. The mother wears a black ribbon, or the father carves a small cross into the doorframe, but the wheel of labor turns on. There is a stoic resilience here that is humbling. They do not move on in the sense of forgetting. They move forward because standing still means death for the rest. For the surviving siblings, the death of a brother or sister is a formative trauma. They learn early that they are the spare who became the heir, or that they are the lucky ones. They grow up with the ghosts of their siblings as constant companions. A boy might be named John, and when he dies, the next son is also named John. It is not a lack of imagination. It is a refusal to let the name die. A stubborn insistence that a John will survive. The survivor carries the weight of the lost potential. They must live for two. As the years grind on, the empty spaces at the table are filled by new arrivals, or they remain as silent gaps. The parents age, their bodies worn down by the labor we have witnessed, and the children who have run the gauntlet, who survived the perilous threshold, the swaddling, the fire, the fever, the hunger, and the work, are no longer children. The golden hour of the age of reason is long gone. The play of the churchyard is a distant memory. They stand now on the brink of the final transformation. The transition to adulthood in the Middle Ages is not a gradual slide. It is a cliff. And at the bottom of that cliff waits the institution that will define the rest of their lives. The childhood that was so hard-won is about to be traded for a contract. The survivors are ready to be sold. The survivors of the gauntlet, the children who have dodged the fire, outlasted the fever, and grown strong on the pottage, now stand on the precipice of the final act. We see them not as the stumbling toddlers of our beginning, nor the diligent workers of the fields, but as young bodies vibrating with a new kind of tension. They have reached the age of 12 or 14, the canonical age of puberty, and legally, the age of consent for marriage. In the modern world, this biological blooming marks the start of a decade-long buffer zone called adolescence, a protected time of high school dramas, university experiments, and self-discovery. In the medieval world, adolescence is not a bridge. It is a waiting room with no chairs. The pressure to launch is immense, but the path forward is blocked by a wall of economics. We must now navigate the complex, often misunderstood rush toward the altar, where the filthy truth is that childhood ends not with a graduation cap, but with a contract and a bedding sheet. First, we must dismantle the most pervasive myth of medieval romance, the child bride. Pop culture, fed by Romeo and Juliet, tells us that everyone in the Middle Ages married at 13 and was a grandparent by 30. But as we float through the village, we see something different. Among the peasantry, the 90%, marriage is actually a game of patience. A peasant lad cannot marry until he has a cottage and a strip of land to farm. A peasant girl cannot marry until she has a dowry, a cow, a bag of silver coins, or a set of linens she has spun herself. This takes time. Historical demographers have identified the European marriage pattern, where the average age of marriage for rural commoners was actually late, often 23 to 25. These young people are physically adults, biologically ready to reproduce, but socially suspended. They are youths, a distinct and volatile social class. They work as servants in husbandry, saving their pennies, eyeing the land market, waiting for a father to retire or grimly to die, so they can inherit the plow and take a wife. This period of waiting creates a unique friction. We see the youth culture of the village, which is rowdy, sexually charged, and heavily policed. The young men form abbeys of misrule or bachelors' guilds. They are the self-appointed moral police of the village. If a husband beats his wife too hard, or if a widow marries a man too young for her, these bachelors gather at night for a charivari or rough music. They bang pots and pans, shout obscenities, and humiliate the offenders. It is a riotous, noisy venting of frustration by men who are strong enough to fight wars, but too poor to have a home. For the girls, the waiting is a tightrope walk. They must be chaste to be marriageable, yet they work side by side with men in the fields and barns. The records of the church courts are filled with fornication fines, the tax on slipping up. We see a young couple stealing a moment behind a haystack, terrified not just of hellfire, but of the pregnancy that would ruin their economic timeline. However, if we look up to the castle, the myth of the child bride becomes a disturbing reality. For the nobility, marriage is not about land usage, it is about alliance. Here, the bodies of children are currencies. We watch a betrothal ceremony for two high-born children. The girl might be 12, the boy 14. They stand stiffly in their finery, repeating vows they have been coached to say, per verba de praesenti, I take thee. There is no romance here, only the merging of two coats of arms. The girl is terrified. She is not waiting for a cottage. She is rushing toward a duty that kills. The pressure on a noble bride to produce an heir immediately is crushing. We see the bedding ceremony, a ritual that strikes the modern mind as a nightmare of invasion. The priest blesses the bed, sprinkling it with holy water to drive away demons that might cause impotence. The wedding guests crowd into the room, stripping the couple, joking, and watching until the curtains are drawn. It is the ultimate lack of privacy, a reminder that this union belongs to the family, not the couple. Whether peasant or noble, the wedding day itself is the definitive death of childhood. The ceremony usually takes place at the church door, the ostium ecclesia, not inside at the altar. It is a public contract. The bride does not wear white. That is a Victorian invention. She wears her best dress, perhaps green, symbolizing fertility, or blue, symbolizing purity, with a wreath of flowers or wheat on her head. The groom hands over a coin or a ring, placing it on her thumb, then her second finger, then her third, saying, "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost," before sliding it onto the fourth finger, where a vein is believed to run directly to the heart. It is a beautiful piece of anatomy folklore that survives to this day. But as the ring slides on, the heavy gate of adulthood slams shut. For the girl, the transition is immediate and biological. She is now a good wife. Her hair is covered. Her legal identity is subsumed into her husband's. She becomes a femme covert, a covered woman, unable to own property or sue in court without him. And she faces the great terror, childbirth. She knows the statistics. She has seen her own mother die, or her sisters. She knows that by saying, "I do," she is voluntarily stepping into the ring with the greatest killer of women in history. We see the shadow cross her face even as she dances at the wedding feast. The ale flows, the roasted pig turns on the spit, and the village celebrates the continuity of life, but the bride is calculating the months. For the boy, the transition is one of weight. He is now a householder. He is responsible for the taxes, the tithes, and the behavior of his household. If his wife scolds a neighbor, he pays the fine. If his child breaks a fence, he fixes it. He steps behind the plow, not as a helper, but as the driver. The village looks to him for stability. The playfulness of the bachelor gang must be put aside. He cannot run with the Abbey of Misrule anymore. He is now the man they might target. He sits at the head of the table, cutting the dark bread, and sees the faces of his dependents looking back at him. The hungry gap is now his problem to solve. There is a profound psychological shift here. The medieval mind does not linger on what might have been. There is no midlife crisis, because there was no adolescence to mourn. You are a child, and then you are a function. We see the young couple entering their new home, perhaps a simple one-room wattle and daub hut they built themselves. It smells of fresh mud and hope. They own a pot, a blanket, and an axe. They are the new masters of a tiny kingdom. They lie down together in the dark, exhausted by the feast and the fear. They are survivors of the filth, the disease, and the neglect. They have made it. And in the silence of that first night as adults, they begin the work of creating the next generation. Historians still debate the emotional quality of these arranged or semi-arranged marriages. Did love grow? The filthy truth is that it often did. The partnership of a peasant marriage was a business, yes, but business partners often forge a bond of steel. They faced the famine together. They buried their children together. They warmed each other in the winter. We see a glance shared between them, not the starry-eyed lust of Romeo and Juliet, but the deep, quiet recognition of shared survival. It is a love built on endurance. But the childhood we have followed is gone. The swaddling bands, the walker, the knucklebones, the birch rod, they are artifacts of a past life. The camera of our narrative pulls back, rising through the thatch roof higher and higher. We see the village as a whole now, a patchwork of fields and roofs under the vast indifferent stars. We see the cycle churning. The filthy truth is that medieval childhood was a brief, brutal, and beautiful flash of light in a dark century. It was not a time of innocence protected, but of resilience forged. They were not fragile things. They were iron in the fire. They rushed toward this altar, toward this hard adulthood, because it was the only victory available, to survive long enough to pass the torch. The story of the child is over. The story of the ancestor has begun. The fire in the hearth has burned down to a bed of glowing, breathing embers, casting a soft, pulsing light against the walls of the cottage. The village outside is finally still. The ring of the blacksmith's hammer has ceased. The shout of the harvester is silenced, and the church bell has rung its last peal for Compline, dissolving into the cool night air. We have journeyed through the perilous threshold of the birthing chamber, felt the constriction of the swaddling bands, tasted the grit in the pottage, and stood trembling before the altar of adulthood. Now, as the narrative wheel slows to a gentle halt, we look back at the landscape we have traversed. It is a landscape scarred by hardship. Yes, a terrain of mud, disease, and relentless labor. But seen from this distance, under the forgiving light of history, it is also a landscape of profound, unbreakable beauty. We are left with the echoes of the young, the voices of millions of children who, against staggering odds, managed to weave a thread of life through the dark tapestry of the Middle Ages. The filthy truth about medieval childhood is not ultimately about the filth. It is about the tenacity. It is easy to look back with modern eyes and pity these children, to see them only as victims of a cruel and ignorant time. We shudder at the lack of sanitation, the harsh discipline, the terrifying medical treatments. But to view them only through the lens of suffering is to deny them their humanity. They were not miserable caricatures waiting for the Renaissance to invent happiness. They were vibrant, resilient beings who found joy in the cracks of the pavement. They turned sheep bones into games of skill. They turned sticks into chargers. They turned the heavy work of the harvest into a song. They did not know they were living in a dark age. They knew only that the sun was warm, the bread was sweet when they were hungry, and the fire kept the wolves at bay. We must remember that every single person listening to this story right now exists because a medieval child survived. You are the direct descendant of a survivor. You are here because a peasant girl fought off a fever with nothing but willow bark and a prayer. You are here because a 7-year-old boy stayed awake in the cold to scare the birds from the wheat. You are here because a young couple, exhausted and fearful, chose to build a home and raise a family in the shadow of the plague. Their resilience is woven into your DNA. The strength that allowed them to endure the hungry gap and the frozen winter is the same strength that beats in your heart tonight. We are not separate from them. We are the harvest they planted. As the camera of our mind drifts over the sleeping village, we see the ghosts of the stages we have witnessed. We see the infant in the cradle, no longer bound by linen but sleeping freely, their chest rising and falling in the rhythm of deep rest. We see the toddler, the runabout, safe from the fire and the well, dreaming of the wonders of the garden. We see the apprentice, his hands finally still, the tools laid aside, dreaming of the masterpiece he will one day create. We see the young bride and groom, hand in hand, stepping across the threshold of the future. The anxiety of the day has evaporated, replaced by the peace of the night. The struggle for survival is paused. In the kingdom of sleep, there is no feudal system, no hunger, no cold. In sleep, every child is a king. The myths we dismantled, the rosy-cheeked cherub and the callous parent, have been replaced by a reality that is far more moving. We know now that medieval parents loved their children with a fierce, desperate passion. The filthy truth is that they loved them enough to let them go, to send them to the monastery, the workshop, or the husband's house, because they knew that in a harsh world, independence was the only safety. They armed their children with resilience rather than sheltering them with softness. It was a hard love, a stony love, but it was love nonetheless. We hear it in the grief of the empty cradle, in the frantic prayers at the respite shrine, and in the quiet pride of the father watching his son plow a straight furrow. The darkness of the medieval night is not empty. It is filled with the breathing of the world, the livestock in the byre, the wind in the thatch, the settling of the timbers. It is a world that lives close to the bone, close to the earth. There is a comfort in that closeness. It reminds us that life is persistent, no matter how deep the mud, no matter how cold the winter. The spring always returns. The grain always grows. The child always plays. The filth washes away, but the spirit remains. We can let go of the tension now. We have walked the muddy lanes. We have smelled the smoke. We have felt the rough wool. It is time to step out of the history and back into the sanctuary of your own rest. The story of the medieval child is finished. They have done their work. They have lived their lives. They have passed the torch to us. We can leave them there in the quiet centuries, safe in the knowledge that they endured. They sleep now under the same stars that watch over you. The timeline folds in on itself, and the distance between the 13th century and the 21st century vanishes in the dark. There is only the quiet, the safety, and the sleep. The candle in the solar flickers one last time and goes out. The smoke curls up, a thin grey ribbon vanishing into the rafters. The village is swallowed by the benevolent shadow. The history book closes with a soft thud. The dust settles. The echoes fade. All is well. The journey is over. The heavy gates of the past are gently closing, locking away the noise and the struggle. leaving you safe on this side of time. The air around you is clear and still. There is no work left to be done, no harvest to gather, no fire to tend. The resilience of those who came before you stands as a quiet guard around your rest. You are safe. You are warm. You are free to drift. Let the weight of the centuries sink into the ground, leaving your body light, heavy with relaxation, floating in the velvet dark. The story has faded into a whisper, and the whisper fades into silence. There is only the rhythm of your own breath, slow and steady as the turning of the earth. History sleeps, and so can you. Sweet dreams.